We have arrived at our first session proper, which is terribly exciting. This one to explore where Indigenous knowledge methodologies intersect with research infrastructures. To moderate that session, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Louisa Warren. Louisa is CSIRO's Executive Manager for Indigenous Engagement, overseeing, among other things, the implementation of CSIRO's Reconciliation Action Plan, or RAP. She's a proud Torres Strait Islander woman. She also owns a basset hound and a boxer, which is objectively delightful. Will you please welcome to the stage, Louisa Warren.
Good morning, everyone. So as Chris mentioned, my name's Louisa Warren. My family are from Bardu Island up in the Torres Strait. So I just want to acknowledge country and thank Tribal Experience for welcoming us here this morning. I have the great pleasure of moderating today's conversation, but before we actually do get into that conversation, I would like to introduce our first keynote speaker. So Dr. Maggie Walter is a Palawa member of the Briggs family of Lutruwita, Tasmania, and Distinguished Professor Emerita at the University of Tasmania. Maggie's research challenges accepted explanations for Indigenous inequality, and she writes extensively in the fields of Indigenous data sovereignty, and Indigenous methodologies. She is currently a Commissioner with the Yurok Justice Commission, Australia's first truth-telling inquiry. Could you please welcome Dr. Maggie Walter to the stage? Thank you.
Yapalingana. I'm not sure how I'm going to work this. Louise, can you just show me which one? There it does. There it works. Yes, so my name's Maggie Walter, and I acknowledge the Turrbal, Yagara and Jagera peoples, and in keeping with my own cultural obligations, I introduce myself. So I'm from Lutruwita, Tasmania. I'm from that northeast corner there that's circled. I'm pretty proud of that, but so is every other Palawa person in Tasmania, and the reason being is that colonisation killed everybody except 9 women who went on to have children of their own. There were only 9 women who kept us going. 4 of them were daughters of the cool dude at the top, who's Manalagena. One of them was my ancestor, Warthmotiena. And the only reason those women and the children survived is that they were kidnapped by sealers who were in the Bass Strait Islands, and they were taken from the northeast. And that is my grandmother, Dalrymple, and my father, Cease, underneath. So Indigenous knowledges are coming to the fore in Australia, but I say that with slight pause because they've been coming to the fore for about 25 years, as far as I know, just from my experience. So the latest Australian research priorities put Indigenous knowledges at the centre. So for all of you, thinking of things, whatever your field, I want you, as we go through this little presentation, to think about how Indigenous knowledges relate to your particular field. My slides I'm a social scientist, so my slides actually reflect that, but if you can just adapt them to whatever field you're in and really think, because many of you will be in fields where you don't think Indigenous knowledges actually have a connection. And I'm here to challenge that and say, yes, they do, and they will be the better for it. So just some thoughts on Indigenous knowledges. There is no, as far as I can find, a definitive outline of what Indigenous knowledges are, and that makes sense because we come from different countries, we have different cultures and traditions, we have different current knowledge systems. So the little one I've got there, which is something I took from a paper I wrote for the Brent Review back in 2011, and I seem to remember spending hours and hours when I did that trying to find a good definition of Indigenous knowledges, and I think this compilation version is the best I could come up with. But there is an ontological gap between how First Peoples understand Indigenous knowledges and how non-First Peoples mostly understand Indigenous knowledges. And I'm hoping today that we can bring those or close that gap just a little bit. And the key point I want to make, or one of the key points, is that Indigenous knowledges do not have to be traditional to be real. Our knowledge systems did not get frozen at 1788. So constantly when I read things around Indigenous knowledges, the word traditional and the word historic come up repeatedly, as if somehow, if it's not from pre-colonisation times, it doesn't count. But as First People scholars, as First People scientists, our knowledge systems, and as community members and elders, our knowledge systems are in a constant state of development and change, same as Western knowledge systems. So Indigenous methodologies, moving on slightly, again are a field which have been around for more than about 25 years now, since Linda Tuohy-Smith's groundbreaking 1999 book. And I've just put up there a few little ones that have come since. But again, it's frustrating because, like Indigenous knowledges, we are perpetually at the beginning. We never seem to move from starting to think about these things or embedding Indigenous methodologies. We would rather constantly keep talking about it and, dare I say it, writing books about it. The bottom one there is my own book that I wrote with Chris Anderson, who's Métis, on Indigenous quantitative methodologies. And that was in 2013, so a lot has changed in that decade. And we have a new version, a completely new version that's coming out next year, along with Tahu Kukatai and Chelsea Gabel as also authors. Oh, not working now. Okay. So this is the slide I use with statistics to try and get people's minds to actually move to say, what would it look like? So if you can translate it into your own research, what would your research look like if First Peoples were your audience? If First Peoples' priorities and things were what was driving your research? I would put it to you that it would look very, very different to what it looks now. So whether you're in the medical field, the hard sciences, it will always have, especially if you're working in Australia or another country which has a significant, and certainly in the Kansas countries, have an Indigenous dimension to it. So this is my personal bugbear, method and methodology. They are not interchangeable. Okay, a method's just your collection. A methodology is the approach by which you actually come to your research. It is all about you as the researcher. But not you as an individual, you as a raced, gendered, cultured person. So you bring all that with you. And just like a definition of Indigenous knowledges, but this is probably worse because there should be one, there's very, very little. If you look at one of my first, I actually have got Australia's best-selling social research methods text, so I'm the editor of that. And my first job in 2004 was to teach the social research methods course. And I'd have to explain the difference. And I could find almost nothing in all the existing textbooks. And so I would say, well, it's the approach. But somebody would always say, explain it a bit more. It's not clear to me. And if you look at all your articles, it just drives me nuts when I see an article where the methods section is written as the methodology. And so the Western way of looking at the world is so embedded that the articles don't even go there. People just presume they're coming from this neutral ground, which of course they are not. None of us are. As First Peoples, we always go there because we know we need to situate ourselves within the research. So this is what I came up with when I thought, well, I have to go better for these students and actually tell them what it is. So this is my recipe for a methodology. So it is about our ontological position, our epistemological position, and our axiological position. And they all come from who we are and our socio-cultural position. It's only then that we actually get, and this is, I guess, more social scientists, but even with the physical scientists, the theoretical frameworks that make sense to us. You know, why do I like Bourdieu but not some of the others? It's all driven by this. And for First Peoples, it is driven by our life world position. Now, this is who we are as we try and work out our place in society and the work that we do. So especially for those in Kansas countries, we are guided around by two different intersubjectivities. And for those of you who have read some like philosophy and have read Habermas and Husserl and others, the Western life world theoretical frame is really, well, it blew me away when I was reading it. And it just sort of lets us know that what we see, reality, is not just hard fact. It is actually very subjective, and it's very subjective. How we make sense of the world, how we make sense of the world of our place within it, really comes back to how we are positioned in that world. What is it that gives us meaning? The problem with those guys, of course, they're wonderful, but they failed to recognise, with all they're doing this wonderful philosophy, that they were male and white and middle class. And that might have impacted their understanding of reality as well. So we have these two intersubjectivities: who we are as people, our peoplehood, and then who we are as colonised, dispossessed minorities, the peoplehood that we are denied. And whatever we do, we are always, and they're inextricably linked. And those two intersubjectivities will be intertwined when you are looking at how First Peoples and how Indigenous knowledges and methodologies interact with your research, and certainly with research in the infrastructure. So, Indigenous methodologies always reflect the Indigenous life world. It makes visible what is important to First Peoples and how the meaning that we make. It's founded on our ways of knowing, being and doing. It upholds and builds on our collective cultural values and belief systems. It draws from our understandings of how the world is and our place within it. And it uses methods which is consistent with those. But that's most methods. So that's, if you're looking for an Indigenous methodology, that's what it should look like when it's deployed. Yep. Okay. And just when we're taking this a little bit further, it means that we have to think about, when we're doing research, any research, we have to think about our own life world, how we are positioned. How do we understand our own position in the world? And then we think about our epistemological position. And this is where Indigenous knowledges come in and where Western knowledges come in. So who are your knowers in your research? Is it other scientists? Which scientists? What is counted as knowledge? If there are different knowledges going, which knowledge system or which knowledge is prioritised? What are the knowns and how do you know it? So the epistemological aspect is really critical. Ontologically, it's again, how do we think about that problem? If it's something with an Indigenous dimension, and I would, yes, even if it doesn't look like it on paper, have a think, does it have one? How do we understand the position of First Peoples in this? What are the assumptions? And what are our values and beliefs? So we know in First Peoples, in Australia and elsewhere, there are a lot of values and beliefs about us. We also know that 90% of non-Indigenous Australians do actually not know any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. And those 10% that do, the vast majority know them as either work colleagues or as clients. So you really need to take a step back and have a think about where you sit when you're thinking about Indigenous peoples and where your values and assumptions and beliefs and understandings actually come from. And so just to finish, I'm just going to look a little bit at the Indigenous data sovereignty, because that is critical for all the work that you do. Indigenous data. We actually put a definition of this in, and this is a globally agreed definition. We sort of draw on the work of the British Columbia First Nations Data Governance Institute, because the first thing we find as First Nations scholars is that somebody will always try and put a bracket around what is Indigenous and what is not. And it's not us doing that. So basically, our definition says it's everything. Indigenous data everything that relates to us or affects our lives at the individual or collective level. You can't say that bit over there. You can have that bit, but not that bit. It's everything. And Indigenous data sovereignty. It is about our right as Indigenous peoples to govern the collection, management, access, interpretation, dissemination and reuse of data related to us. Oops. Again, it's about everything. It reflects our obligations as First Peoples to see data as belonging to the collective, not the individual. It belongs to First Peoples, and particularly the First Peoples from which those data are drawn. It's about accountability under UNDRIP, if we're looking for something to give some sort of authorising frame. And it demands that data reflect our priorities and that contribute to our well-being as defined by us. And it's dual direction. So within Australia, I'm a member of the Myam-Nairi Wingara Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective, along with others, some of whom are in the room. And in the first 10 years, we're coming up to nearly 10 years now. In the first 10 years, we really focused on that governance of data, where we tried, and have been successful in some cases, in some areas, to actually get the state, mostly the state, who are the primary holders of data about First Peoples in Australia, to actually think about what they're doing and change the way that they do Indigenous data. So it was about controlling that data of disregard. So almost all the data that are held about us are about what's wrong with us, about what we are as a problem, how unhealthy we are, how low weight our babies are, how uneducated we are, how imprisoned we are. That's the narrative. And for those of you who don't know an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, that is somebody you do know, the Australian Statistical Indigene. Everybody knows that person. And we worked on principles, and we've done a fair bit there. But now, as we move into the second decade, we're focusing much more around data for governance. And I think this is where your research comes in. So this is the data that First Peoples need for nation rebuilding. What we need as First Nations, collectively and more nationally, to actually rebuild and have a stake in our own future. So it's dual direction. It's governance of data and data for governance. And governance is implementation. And it is all about being Indigenous leadership and Indigenous decision making. You cannot make those decisions for us. You cannot lead it for us. We are here to do it ourselves. Bolika, that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. That was, I think, in terms of the context of what we're talking about today, in terms of, international, conference and research, really founding that, that strong foundation around Indigenous data rights, and what does Indigenous knowledge and methodologies look like when it intersects with research infrastructure. So we're now going to be joined in a panel conversation this morning. And because it is an international conference, we have the great pleasure of welcoming some of our colleagues and friends who have travelled very far to be here today. So can I please welcome Dr. Stephanie Runninghawk Johnson from the Olkala Nation. Dr. Stephanie is the Executive Director of Local Contexts. She collaborates with Indigenous communities, bringing skills and knowledge of decolonising and indigenising work. Stephanie translates for institutions how and why protecting Indigenous data sovereignty is crucial, giving them ways to meet their obligations through local contexts, labels and notices. Can you please welcome Stephanie to the stage, who's travelled all the way from Washington. Thank you. Joining us also on the panel is another friend and colleague travelled all the way from Aotearoa, Associate Professor Maui Hudson, is a member of the Whakatoa Nation and the Director of Te Kotahai Research Institute at the University of Waikato and a council member for local contexts. His research interests include issues of Indigenous data, sovereignty, and he is a co-author of the CARE Principles for Indigenous Data Governance. Could you please welcome Maui to the stage? Thank you. Just checking this is, can you hear me? Great, fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us here on stage today. So I'm going to start with you, Maui, in terms of really kickstarting our conversation. So thank you for travelling all the way. And as we heard from Maggie's keynote earlier today, as Indigenous people, we know that we are the most researched peoples in the world, and I also want to acknowledge that there are many other First Nations and Indigenous peoples in the room that have also travelled here today. And as we heard from Maggie's presentation, that presents similar challenges and concerns when our knowledge historically has been extracted and published in various research institutions, publications, websites. It's all out there. Can you share with the audience how you are working to address this within the context of research infrastructure?
Nice easy one to kick off. Yeah, look, there's a couple of comments I just wanted to make just as we get started. You know, really tying together the sort of the thoughts that came from the people that were doing the initial welcome as well. You know, the need to develop research infrastructures and how research is in place to support development in society. And we've seen that, and we continue to see that with the infrastructure and technology that's developed. But the way in which that is then, how that then translates into benefits for all parts of our society is the thing that's become a problem. And I think, you know, the ability for the infrastructures, and particularly the research infrastructures that are being created now, and we saw this, you know, the massive SKA low, they're really these huge global infrastructures, and how they make benefit or change at a local level is pretty disparate. Even though it's, you know, all of us that are contributing to how that comes about. And I think that's sort of, you know, one of the challenges that we're dealing with is what does that look like, and what do infrastructures look like that can help provide benefit at a local community, whether that's Indigenous communities, which we're focused on and talking about here, or smaller Pacific Island nations or other Indigenous peoples and local communities. And that's sort of what I've been focusing on in a lot of ways, trying to think about that. We had the reference to FAIR. Open science has been one of the ways in which we've been able to kind of connect globally. But in that context too, thinking about what does it mean to do things locally that allow different nations to have more control, whether we're talking about Indigenous nations or small and emerging countries, have more control over the development and the opportunities that emerge from a research space. And I think everything at the moment, which is kind of increasing our ability to access information, access data, is funneling it up into the places which largely have the most resources, like Australia, like Europe, and the most technology and capacity to then benefit from it. And you're starting to see, I think, pushback from countries and other places that's saying, hey, we're getting left behind. We're contributing to this, but there's not enough happening that is providing benefit for us or value to not only the things that are being developed, but value in ways that, as Maggie was talking about, answer the questions that are important for those places themselves.
Thanks, Maui, and really good point around, you know, what we heard earlier this morning around the SKA project. And I also note we've got Wadjuri Yamaji people in the room here today, so also want to acknowledge the Wadjuri Yamaji gentleman who's travelled all the way over from Wadjuri country to be here. And so when we think about that example in that context, Maui, you know, when communities are handing over data as it relates to cultural, you know, heritage or, you know, sacred information, tell me a bit more about the work that you've been leading in terms of how that can be protected around the biocultural labels, for those of you that may not understand what the biocultural labels are. If I can ask you to share a bit more on that.
Sure. So, so I guess in a lot of ways, I've been really trying to think, and this is a really interesting intersection between what represents projects and the things that people can do, great work connecting with individuals, connecting with communities, doing the sort of work that we saw around, but how that translates into then the sort of the research infrastructures that are being developed to maintain the continued reuse of that information and the opportunities that come off it. And that's sort of a different level, and we haven't really thought at the infrastructure level how we can do things there that make that responsive to sort of these Indigenous communities in the same sort of way. It's all been developed in ways that are orientated towards supporting the next lot of questions that the researchers are going to answer, but not necessarily the next sort of questions that the community might want answered. And some of that comes about from the sort of just the different sort of information we decide to collect, the different sort of metadata we associate with that information. And so, we've been thinking about what kinds of Indigenous metadata is necessary that helps that data be more reusable. So when we talk about fair, how do we make it fair for those communities, not just fair as this kind of useful for a global research society? And that's one of the things we've been doing. And, I don't want to talk about all the things that Stephanie's going to talk about, but, it has really been thinking about different ways that you can label that information, both so that you know where the provenance of it comes from, at least in terms of those Indigenous communities, and the sorts of protocols and permissions that might be in place around the reuse that enable them to be connected to sort of downstream research activities that might emerge from the collection of that and reuse of that information.
Thanks, Maui. And that's a really good segue to Stephanie in terms of the work of local context. So can you please share with the audience, for those who may not know who local context is, the work that you do and how researchers and organisations can work with local context?
Yeah, thank you. It's a big challenge to summarize local context in such a brief fashion, but one of the things that I was thinking about as Dr. Walter was talking is that all data is Indigenous data, and so we have to really think about when we collect any sort of data, how Indigenous communities remain connected to those pieces of data as it travels, right? As Maui was just talking about, how does it travel? How do we keep our communities connected to that? And so local context has developed some tools for digitally labeling information to keep it connected to Indigenous communities. And we have labels. We call these labels for communities, and so communities can go into that information and say what they want to say about information. We have a very long history of researchers collecting information from and about Indigenous people, and those people are not connected to it and they don't have a say in it. And so these labels are one tool to be able for communities to say, it comes from us. This is our information. This is coming from us. This is coming from our communities. This is coming from our places. This is coming from our lands, our waters, our air, our skies. It's a way for communities to indicate how that information should be used. Is it something that should be shared? Is it for just educational purposes? Is this something that they want to have a say in if it's used in the future? And those permissions and those protocols are connected to these labels that can be placed by communities onto all sorts of different information and data. We also have what we call notices that are for researchers and for organizations that for you all to put into place to say this information does come from an Indigenous community or from an Indigenous place. And we have one that I really love. It's called Open to Collaborate, and that's an indication that the researcher or the organization wants to collaborate with Indigenous communities when it comes to thinking about that information and that data. And I think that really ties back into thinking about this research infrastructure piece that we're all here to chat about today, right? Is how do we make sure that there is space in the infrastructure for Indigenous communities to be connected to that information, for them to have a say into what happens as we go forward. And as that information goes out into the world, what is the infrastructure that's in place for for instance, our tools to remain connected to that. I'm sure there's lots of other ways that work can happen as well, but I think that is one way to think about how do we keep connection for communities, and not just connection, but when we're thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty, having Indigenous communities have a say over how that information is used and where it goes and what happens to it as it leaves their community.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
Sure. Yeah, so I just want to add, I mean, it's a little bit like, we've got all these different sorts of ways of IDing information now, whether it's DOIs, RAIDs, research activity IDs, different sorts of ways that allow us to connect things as it's circulating across these, digital environments. And we have things that usually connecting researchers, research institutions, outputs, but the missing piece in all of that is anything that connects it back into the community. And so I think, local context, at least in terms of what they've done, is a tool that then starts to bring that into place and allow that to circulate in the same way as all of these other things are moving around. And, really thinking about the different ways in which having that kind of identifier is not only bringing them into that system and having them start to feel like they can be a part of it, but you have different ways that you can then sort of measure impact in terms of the connections you have with those communities. And so we've been working particularly around if there are labels, notices in place, that they can then be represented as things are published. So working through publishing protocols with publishers, thinking about what it looks like in terms of data repositories and where they have things sitting. So there's a whole series of projects that sort of local context is working alongside, sort of shaped in relation to the care principles as well, about sort of like those practical mechanisms that will make changes in infrastructures or make it easy for people just to do the right thing, do the thing that they should be doing.
And I think that really, one of the things you said was that we've been talking about this for a really long time, and now we actually need to do something about this, and this using these tools from local context could be one potential way to make those steps of actually doing some work and actually engaging with communities in the process.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Maui. And the keynote that we heard from Maggie earlier is really trying to, how do we sort of have the space to talk about Indigenous rights when it comes to Indigenous research methodologies, and the conversation that we're having this morning, as part of the panel, is what tools are available to you as researchers, as organisations, as policymakers in the room, because it can be a big topic for people to get their head around, and we wanted to really have a conversation around what tools and case studies are available where you can learn and build your own capability and make sure that you embed these approaches within your own research. Maggie, I would like to now bring you into the conversation, and as we're here for the next couple of days, one of the emerging technologies that many people in the room are starting to work with, and even our communities are starting to work with, is AI. So, in terms of working with artificial intelligence, your keynote really touched on Indigenous research, Indigenous methodologies, and the considerations that we all need to be aware of when we're partnering with Indigenous communities. I'd like to know your thoughts on how this applies when we're working with AI. What are some of the risks? But where do you also see the opportunities in this space?
Thanks, Louisa. Look, AI is so exciting, and I know I'm not telling anybody in this room, but we know in 5 years that everything we do and how we do it will be dramatically changed through AI. So it does create wonderful opportunities for First Peoples, but there are a lot of risks here as well. I'm just going to touch on a few of them because we could really, there's risk after risk after risk. Probably the biggest one for me is that it takes it further from Indigenous peoples. So data and knowledge and everything else is removed again, one huge step, so that we are likely to have fewer First Peoples actually working in the AI space. It also puts a tremendous burden on communities and Indigenous entities and organisations to really know how their data are being used. It puts further risk on data as the data gets sucked up. Who it belongs to and how it should be treated is likely to get lost in the process. It suddenly becomes this sort of, well, it's data, it's in AI, it belongs to everybody. And no, it doesn't. But our chances, and what Maui and Stephanie have been talking about with the traditional knowledge and biocultural labels, does provide one way of keeping it connected. So it is that, and it becomes more objective. Just because a machine did it, supposedly all the human biases and ways of seeing the world and knowledge prioritisation are seen as not, and they're there, you know, like somebody writes the first algorithm, and those algorithms are full of presumptions and assumptions that are very human and usually very, very white and Western and colonising. The other thing I think that worries me about AI is, as Maui and Stephanie have both talked about, much of what is out there about us as First Peoples, the vast majority of it is not written by us. So it reflects a certain way of understanding us. And that most of that way is a way that does deny our peoplehood. It is, much of it is about the problem that we are and what is wrong with us. So if that gets taken up and becomes even more, well, I don't know how it can become more dominant, but it is a real risk that we can never get out from under that big millstone that's around our, you know, mixing up my metaphors here. But it's a huge burden on our shoulders all the time that we have to try and extract ourselves from this sort of, this burden of disregard that we all labour under. So on the positive side though, I really think that AI can offer us as First Peoples in digitising, in pulling information that we wouldn't normally see how to connect together. It can provide us, and you know, somebody from Lutruwita, I would love to be able to pull all those things. Most of our culture is what is written by those who decimated us. But we can't even access that. So to be able to pull it all together and learn more about ourselves would be fantastic.
Maui, I can see you've got the mic ready to go, so I'm going to throw to you.
Yeah, no, I'm actually getting into this one. A couple of things I just want to talk about. One is what it means in terms of infrastructures as well. You know, so a lot of the infrastructure is being put together, you know, sort of large scale stuff, and it was, you know, really good to see the kind of reference to mid scale infrastructures as well. But I think if we wanted to create some more responsive global ecosystems, we're also going to have to think about micro infrastructures. And so there's going to be places where a lot of data which is digitized, particularly from sort of our communities, if we're wanting to engage actively in sort of AI and what it can provide for us, it needs to happen in sort of a kind of siphoned off environments or places that are a little bit more protected than the open spaces in which most things are going to operate. Now, that doesn't mean that this can't be federated or there's sort of interoperability that sits within them, but there needs to be steps for communities, for small countries to be able to build up, bring together some of that information, start to surface some of the knowledge that isn't known at the moment into a place which they feel comfortable with before it becomes a part of the sort of the open world spaces. And I think if we could be sort of thinking about where that sits, then that's going to provide another way in which those countries and communities feel like it's something that can respond to their needs at the same time as well.
And Maui, that's a really good segue to the next question, because like a lot of people in the room will be learning about this, trying to unpack it, trying to understand. So can you share, and I'll ask all of the panel to share, have you seen some really good examples or case studies around communities that are leading this work? We don't have time to unpack every single case study, but if we could just reference a few for the audience to understand in terms of some key takeaways from today.
Yes, so there's an interesting one at the moment about trying to create a Māori generative AI, so Indigenous generative AI. Now, a lot of generative AI needs, really huge data sets. It's only going to happen on a global scale. But it's, as Maggie said, it's feeding off information that isn't necessarily correct, stuff that's been generated in the past. And so where is the place where they can start working to develop some more verified sort of information by the community itself, but that can sit in its own place, and that can be added to what's coming up through the large open language models, and then have that provide a different sort of answer. So there's all kind of different ways that people are starting to think about the ways in which that might come about. And there's a couple of initiatives just starting for New Zealand to go down that track. There's been a really sort of successful one around language learning, text to speech, speech to speech, speech to text, all of those things, making use of Māori language, where they engaged directly with communities and got them doing, building up the corpus of knowledge that was needed to activate those new tools.
Thanks, Maui. And Stephanie, any examples you'd like to share with the audience?
Sure. So one that comes to mind for me out of the U.S. is the Passamaquoddy Nation, and they're thinking about their cultural heritage and their information in ways that they want to connect with with different institutions that are holding that knowledge. And so thinking about how do they digitally connect and digitally repatriate that information and bring that back to their community in ways perhaps they can't physically do that, but how do we do that in digital ways? How do we do that in ways that make sure that their community has access and authority over the information that is already out there, and in addition to information that is being generated currently? So thinking about MOUs with universities and other institutions to make sure that those connections are there and that they are able to access all of their information for their community, and their community is able to do what they want to do with it in their own context. And so thinking about their data for governance in so many ways.
And Maggie?
Look, I don't have any examples, and I'm really sad about that, because we are a long way behind in Australia. And unfortunately, we cannot rely on First Peoples to do this for ourselves, because we don't have the money, we don't have access to the infrastructure, we don't have the number of scientists that we need. So we need the non-Indigenous, CSIRO and everybody else to really take this and to actually not give us a little niche space at the side, but to actually make sure that we are, like that thing I showed you in the middle with Indigenous knowledges right at the centre of the science research priorities, that we are in everything, and that you make sure you have First Peoples with you right at the start. We can't be an add-on at the end. We have to be there right at the start, and you can't rely on us to do it because we just don't have the infrastructure, and we don't have the spaces, and we don't have the seniority and the leadership. So we're looking to you guys. Don't let us down.
Thanks, Maggie. And I guess from a CSIRO perspective, you know, through our Reconciliation Action Plan, we've actually made commitments around this in terms of creating an Indigenous data governance framework across the organisation, and how we, you know, work with Indigenous data in terms of what Maggie spoke about earlier, in terms of the fair and care principles that you also heard from Maui. So, you know, we're one of many, and hopefully people in the room here in an Australian context can also look at this, because these are conversations that are happening locally in our communities and internationally, as you can hear from the panel here today. So more and more Indigenous communities nationally and globally, you know, are really standing up their rights in terms of access to data. That is, you know, the definition that you heard from Maggie earlier today. And more of that will happen as you enter into research agreements and partnerships with Indigenous communities, both here, you know, in Australia and globally. So we're always looking to learn and connect from one another, and we are a close network, so we do have those ongoing conversations. And we are almost at time, so I'm going to ask the panel if they can quickly share what are some practical things researchers, policymakers and organisations can do after today's session. Maggie? I'll start with Maggie and I'll work my way back.
Yeah, have a little reflect. You know, have a sit down, have a think about the research you're planning, the research you're doing, what is the Indigenous space in this, and how are you ensuring that Indigenous data governance is taking place, and that you are being honest with how you're dealing with our data. And if you get a little bit of what we call an ontological disturbance when you do that, relax and think about it and think, okay, what can I do to fix this? Better late than never.
Stephanie?
I'll go back to the what can you actually do. Think about some action steps that you can take to work with communities. They want to work with you in so many instances. So what are those things that you can actually do instead of saying, oh yeah, we want to do this, or oh we have, at least in the U.S. we see people, oh we do a land acknowledgement. And that's where it stops. And so my challenge would be, what are the things you can actually do? What are some tools that you can employ to take those steps to work with communities and work for communities?
Maui, final words.
Yeah, look, I think certainly in a policy space, because there's so much policy that sits here around supporting open science and the FAIR principles. Anywhere they're talking about the FAIR principles, I think you need to be adding the CARE principles to it. That becomes a place which you can then start thinking about what those practical steps are. And there needs to be, essentially not just like the guideline stuff is useful, and there's places that you find that, but making changes within the infrastructures, what are some kind of practical things? I think that the tools are great. We're working with GBIF, Global Biodiversity Information Facility, ODIS, trying to make it possible for those things to be reflected in that sort of infrastructures. So, and that's only come about because there's been people in those groups that have decided this is important, and they've made the steps to make changes to move it forward, and we just need that.
Fantastic. Look, we are at time, and I think I'm getting the eye in terms of it's time for morning tea break. So could you please thank our panel, Maggie, Stephanie, and Maui, one last time. And obviously we didn't have time for questions today, but the panel are going to be around today, so please take the time over the morning tea break, the lunch breaks, to connect and to build those relationships, which are really important in terms of this space and our work together moving forward. Thank you.